Fantastic. All righty. So we are going to kick us off with the Kahoot. We're going to have a really quick guest lecture by someone who will explain in a bit. Instead of the group activity, I'll do my lecture about the theories at that time, and then we will have a quick debrief and exit at that point. All right, so future Dr. Best, are you there and ready to roll with our Kahoot?
Yes, I'm
All
here.
right, take it away.
Okay, I am going to share my screen.
Hopefully it's working. Yay, awesome.
Okay. Okay, so everyone, you can type in your web browser. Okay, you can type in your web browser, kahoot.it. It's on the screen, and then you enter the game pin that's on the screen, or if you have the app, you can enter the game pin that's on the screen as well. All right, we're waiting for, it looks like about 6 more people to log in. Does anyone have questions about joining? I'm not seeing the chat in my screen view, but it looks like there's about 6 people, or some people are like actually leaving. Is it working on everyone's end? If someone could maybe unmute themselves.
Any questions in the chat so far about it?
Okay, cool. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started then. The question is, how do I start it? Wow, okay. Oh, it's counting down. Perfect. Okay. Or maybe not. Oh, gosh.
I think if somebody joins, it restarts the countdown.
Okay. Is there a way to like just auto start it? I thought there would be like a button here. But apparently not. Oh, okay. Here we go.
You got it. You got it.
Okay, marketing of unhealthy food, alcohol, and cigarettes is disproportionately heavy in which neighborhoods? High income, low income, middle income, upper middle income. Okay, cool. What percentage of healthcare costs are attributable to prevention? 10 to 12%, 48 to 50%, 30 to 38%, or 2 to 3%?
Okay, as the new scores are kind of going up, I'm seeing that some people have never done a cuckoo before. So, oh, well, go. Sorry, go.
Now there should be a way for me to pause it. Okay, let's see. Maybe on the next screen.
It's okay. It's okay. Let them roll. But as you're doing it, know that both your answer and the timing matter for folks who have never done it before.
Behavioral interventions focus on adherence, coping, and stress management can improve disease management and quality. True or false? A behavior change intervention in a clinical setting is best guided by which treatment perspective? Individual, community, or population? Which of the following is not one of the 4 behavioral risk factors examined in the Behavior Matters reading? Physical inactivity, tobacco use, poor diet, or air pollution? Which of the following is not a main factor affecting a person's likelihood to change a health behavior? Physician advice, self-efficacy, goals, outcome expectancies. The theory of planned behavior examines an individual's beliefs, attitudes, intentions, behavior, and perceived control for that behavior. True or false? What is the most important determinant of behavior in the theory of planned behavior and the theory of reasoned action? Attitude, community, behavioral intention, or cultural norms? Factors in the social cognitive theory that affect the likelihood a person will change a health behavior include self-efficacy, goals, outcome expectations, all of the above.
I need more trash talk in between with scoreboard.
Behavior has an impact on an individual's health outcome, true or false? That was good. Okay.
Yay.
What are the behavioral roles that may impact the outcome of cardiovascular disease? Diet, physical activity, stress, all of the above. The trans theoretical model is best known for going through the 7 stages in one's journey from awareness to action. True or false?
Ooh.
Using the health belief model, which of the following is a strategy to demonstrate the perceived susceptibility of skin infections? Poster on best practices for rinsing and disinfecting wounds, sharing risk of skin infections and recommended preventative actions, define who is at most risk for skin infections. Okay. Behavioral interventions can improve one's quality of life. True or false?
We don't get 100% on this. I'm telling you, future Dr. Best. Thank you.
Yay. What is the concept of the ecological perspective? Behavioral effects and is affected by multiple levels of influence. Behavior are proof of an individual's self-efficacy. Individual behavior both shapes and is shaped by the social environment, both A and B.
I'm realizing we don't have A and B on there, so we'll figure that out for our request. Yeah.
Right.
Not the music.
An individual is in the action stage when they intend to act within 30 days and have taken behavioral steps. True or false?
Okay, we got a lot to review for the stage models. I'm excited about that.
Stereotypes are a result of social diffusion learning. True or false? Tailored print communications and telephonic delivered interventions are examples of diffusion of innovation theory. True or false? Yes, go Allie.
Clap it up for everyone, really. What a wonderful first event. Janae, you're getting a lot of questions about Kahoot generally. So
Oh, okay.
well, how about this? Because what our goal is to, let me put my video on. What our goal is to show just a bit of a lecture from a lecture that's actually being live streamed right now. And I thought it would be a really great opportunity to get a chance to see the scholar. So I'm going to share my screen just for a second. So thank you so much for that, Janae. And if you do have questions, hopefully Janae can answer some of them during this lecture or afterward as well. So Dr. David Williams is a professor at the Harvard School of Public Health, the THCM School of Public Health, does a lot of really amazing work around race and racism, and actually had his start at U of M, was a U of M doc student and a professor in the School of Public Health, maybe, and sociology for a minute before getting scooped by Harvard. So I wanted, because he's being live streamed right now, for us to get just a bit of an opportunity to hear what he's saying, because it's, to me, seems really relevant for the times that we're in. And this is a lecture being given at the National Academy of Sciences National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I will be on there a little later today at 3, so I'm excited to join after Dr. Williams and a number of really amazing scholars. But I wanted to hear just a bit of his lecture with you all today, because we'll be talking about race and racism throughout the course as something that I'm really interested in, and also some of the things that we are even engaging in with the strike as well. So thought it was really relevant, and I hope that you all will enjoy this journey of about 35 minutes of his lecture today. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and then we'll try to join in on him already started. So one second. Okay, I'm gonna hope that this works. So he's already started. I paused it, and we'll see if it picks up from the beginning or picks up wherever he is right now.
Introduction, and I am happy to join the panel here today. I'm going to share my screen so the largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And she finds that 2/3 of all Black children, 58% of Latino kids, and 53% of Native American kids are residing in very low or low opportunity neighborhoods. In contrast, 2/3, almost 2/3 of white and Asian kids are in very high or very high opportunity neighborhoods compared to about 1 in 5 African American or Latino kids. Not only does this absence of opportunity at a neighborhood level then leads to large racial ethnic differences in socioeconomic status. So it's not by chance that these differences in socioeconomic status exist. David Cutler, an economist at Harvard University, using national data looking at a cohort of Blacks and whites making it in the labor force, shows that statistically, if we could eliminate residential segregation in America, we would erase Black-white differences in income, in education, and in unemployment, and reduce Black-white differences in single motherhoods by 2/3. All of those differences are driven by opportunity linked to place. And Rash Chetty, another Harvard economist, has been studying the intergenerational transmission of economic resources, and he has looked at Blacks and white children who begin at the same level of household income and what happens to the next generation. And he finds that those Black kids who begin at the same level of household income as their white counterparts, 99% of census tracts in America, they are doing more poorly than their white counterparts. Why? Because they live in neighborhoods that differ in access to opportunity. When African American children live in neighborhoods with good resources, they do as well as white kids. The point is, those neighborhoods are very rare in the United States. So when we talk about the inequalities that exist, sometimes people like to say we are dealing with a broken system. I would argue we are not dealing with a broken system. We are dealing with a carefully crafted system, functioning as planned, successfully implementing social policies, many of which are rooted in racism. So these inequalities that we see are not accidents or acts of God. They reflect the successful implementation of social policy, and they illustrate the ways in which racism, through its systemic mechanisms, has produced a truly rigged system in the United States. I think this has research implications and policy implications. We need to routinely capture data on the geographic location of people in our studies. We need to link that to resources like Dr. Acevedo Garcia's diversity data for kids. And we need an enhanced understanding of how these structural mechanisms lead to changes in health over time. In addition to this institutional racism, there is also the interpersonal dimensions of discrimination that are a source of toxic stress. I will illustrate that with work that I have done using the Everyday Discrimination Scale. It's a 9-item scale that just captures little indignities: being treated with less courtesy and respect than others, receiving poorer service than others at restaurants or stores, people acting as if they think you are not smart, or if they're afraid of you, or they think you are dishonest, or they're better than you are. Just a lot of minor indignities. I want to just illustrate what research has found, that higher levels of everyday discrimination predicts incident breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, predicts higher levels of use of substances to cope with distress, predicts subclinical indicators of heart disease, predicts the onset of blood pressure, poorer sleep duration, poorer sleep quality, predicts a number of markers of biological functioning like inflammation and allostatic load, predicts obesity and weight gain, predicts lower levels of using screening tests recommended by your provider, and predicts worse mental health. So that's a broad range of indicators that are all linked to the accumulation of these little indignities on a daily basis. There is growing research indicating that this interpersonal discrimination has negative effects on children. So I'll review with you quickly some recent studies looking at this vicarious discrimination. This is a review paper by Naomi Priest, and she finds there are a number of studies that document that discrimination experienced by a mother while she's pregnant predicts lower birth weight and preterm birth in her child. Here is a study of Mexican immigrant parents that finds both the father's experience of racial bias and the mother's experience of racial bias leads to worse problems in their children. Here is another study, longitudinal study, that looked at the everyday discrimination scale, that the levels that a mother had while pregnant, and it predicts more problems with development at 6 months and at 1 year in the child. So what's happening to the parents also directly affects the child. We also have, this is a small study from New Haven, Connecticut, that used just 54 mother-child dyads, but it was able to document that the maternal discrimination was linked to increased inflammation in the child. So we are looking at not only behavioral problems, but even underlying biological processes affected by experiences of discrimination. And here is a study from Australia looking at 124 kids, average age 11, most of them indigenous or ethnic minority. And it found that these children at young ages reporting high levels of discrimination have increased waist circumference, increased blood pressure, and increased inflammation. So we are documenting that just these indignities of discrimination is adversely affecting the health of children growing up in our contemporary societies. Stresses in early life and adulthood may be passed on to future generations. This is an issue we haven't fully studied in depth when it comes to race and ethnicity, but there's reason to think that there are important patterns that we need to pay attention to. In studies of humans, we have documented that exposure to childhood sexual abuse, childhood physical abuse, mental disorders, and intimate partner violence have been associated with epigenetic changes in the children. There are studies of the Dutch famine in the 1940s that showed women who were pregnant during that famine and didn't get adequate nutrition, their children have poorer health. Recent research is documenting that their grandchildren also have poorer health, and that exposure of the grandmother is linked to epigenetic changes that are evident 6 months later. Similarly, a study that looked at the impact of this terrible 1998 Quebec ice storm and women who were pregnant at that time has documented that genome-wide changes in 957 genes linked to immune function as a result of the maternal exposure. We also have studies that have documented that Holocaust exposure is associated with epigenetic changes that are evident both in the exposed parent and in their offspring. What this all means is that we need to be paying more attention to the possibilities of long-term epigenetic changes that predict risk of disease linked to the historical trauma that Native Americans have experienced, linked to slavery and its follow-up activities, and Jim Crow for African Americans, and the colonial traumas and abuses experienced by indigenous people, as well as present-day discrimination and institutionalized racism. So what I'm saying is, we have only begun to tap into the full impact of these exposures on health. And what research tells us is that African Americans and Latinos have not only higher levels of racial discrimination, but they have higher levels of a broad range of stressors, economic stressors, psychosocial stressors like the death of a loved one, and physical and chemical stressors as well. In addition to that, recent research is pointing to some added burdens that young people face. This is a study by Brendisha Tynes that looked at youth aged 14 to 18. And this study documented that experiences of discrimination online was linked to increased risk of depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms, and that effect was independent of a global measure of adolescent stress and independent of discrimination in offline context. So it's the unique contribution of discrimination online. More recently, Dr. Tynes has shown in a paper just published last year that among Black and Latinx adolescents, exposure to what she called online traumas, that is seeing someone from your own ethnic group being beaten or arrested or detained or being shot by the police, leads to increased PTSD symptoms and depressive symptoms for those young people. And then this is work that I did with some other colleagues. We linked a database of every police shooting with a database of the mental health in each state. And we were able to document that every police shooting of an unarmed Black male leads to worsening mental health for the entire population, of the entire African-American population of the state in which it occurs for the next 3 months. What's the consequences of exposure to all of these stressors? Researchers are using the terms accelerated aging or premature aging or biological weathering. They're trying to capture the extent to which research is telling us that African Americans and other populations of color are literally aging biologically more rapidly than whites in the United States. Arlene Geronimus uses the term weathering. Imagine a drop of water falling from the rooftop of the building you're sitting into the concrete sidewalk below. If water fell today, it's not a big deal. But if there's a constant drip, drip, drip of water every day this week, every day next week, every day next month, eventually the sidewalk below would become weathered. It will become eroded by the constant exposure to adversity. And what research is telling us is that your age not only captures how long you've lived, but when you live in a bad environment with adverse environmental exposures, your age is also capturing how long you've been exposed to bad environmental conditions and how physiologically you have become compromised as a result of those exposures. So it's not a surprise that national data for CDC tells us that African Americans get a broad range of chronic conditions at markedly younger ages than whites. Here is the data at the same age, 50 to 64. You can see the percentage, 61% of African Americans with high blood pressure compared to 41% of whites. You see a similar pattern with diabetes, and I could go down a list of a broad range of conditions that shows this pattern. Some studies, even looking at telomere length, are suggesting that at the same chronological age among middle-aged adults, African Americans are 8.5 or 10 years older physiologically than whites as a result of this constant exposure to adversity. And then the racism that's deeply embedded in our culture also has negative effects for populations of color, both adults and children. Where do these negative stereotypes come from? Well, a group of scholars created a database of American culture. In this database of about 10 million words, they've placed the books and newspaper and magazine articles that an average college-educated person would read in their lifetime. What's brilliant about this, if you've put American culture in a database, you can ask the question, when the word Black appears in American culture, what adjective most commonly co-occurs with it? It's poor, then violent, then religious, then lazy, then cheerful, then dangerous. When white occurs, wealthy, progressive, conventional, stubborn, successful, educated. For the fun of it, when female occurs, distant, warm, gentle, passive. When male occurs, dominant, leader, logical, strong. Here are the 10 most common stereotypes found for Blacks and whites. And you can see the predominance of negative stereotypes for Blacks. What these data tell me is that when a police officer sees a young Black male and believes him to be more violent and dangerous than the situation actually indicates, we may not necessarily be dealing with a bad cop. We may simply be looking at a normal American who is acting on what is deeply embedded in his subconscious as a result of being raised in this society. Because the research indicates that in 1/3 of the time it takes to blink your eye, when you hold a negative stereotype about a group and you meet someone from that group, you will treat that person differently. You will discriminate against that person. It's an automatic process. It's an unconscious process. It's a normal process. All human beings have these biases. Where we differ is which was the in-groups and out-groups in the particular place where we were socialized. And let me give you an example of how this matters and matters profoundly for young children of color. Blacks, especially Black boys, are suspended and expelled from preschool at a high rate. Compared to white preschoolers, Blacks are 3.6 times as likely to receive 1 or more suspensions. And although Black children make up 19% of preschoolers, there are 47% of those preschoolers suspended 1 or more times, with boys being 3 times as likely as girls to be suspended more frequently. Researchers from Yale University went to a conference where engaged 135 pre-K teachers to watch 12 short videos. And they told them that, sometimes teachers can see problematic behavior before it actually occurs. And they asked the teachers to look at these videos. What the researchers did was they were using eye tracking data to see which of the children, there were 4 children, 2 Black kids and 2 white kids, looking to see which of the children would the teachers focus on. And the eye tracking data revealed that the teachers focused much more on Black children, and especially on Black boys. They spent more time gazing on them than other children. And by the way, this pattern was true for both Black and white teachers. We also have evidence from a National Academy Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Medicine report back in 2003 that there's racial bias exists in access to medical care and inequality of care received. I want to talk about another dimension of internalized racism, the racism in the culture, that some persons may accept some of this negative characterization as true of themselves. I'm drawing here in the work of Claude Steele on stereotype threat. And what Claude Steele did, he would take a group of African-American undergraduates and randomly divide them into 2 groups. One group was told, take a test, and the other group was told, take a test, but Blacks do worse on the test than whites. The group told that Blacks did worse. He could produce this effect simply by asking the group to write their race on the top of the exam sheet before they started the test. Again, just making their race salient created anxieties that led to poorer performance. So I've talked a lot about the problems of these systemic structural biases that racism has created. What can we do about the problems? First, we need to reduce implicit bias. Here is a study from the UK, a very high quality study, randomized double-blind parallel group placebo-controlled study, documented that a single dose of medication can eliminate implicit bias for the next 2 hours in white physicians. Now, I don't think that we can solve the problem of implicit bias by medicating the entire population. I do think this study is important for one reason. We are living in a world where some of our powerful political leaders claim that implicit bias is fake news. The fact that we can intervene on it with a pharmacologic agent suggests that there are fundamental processes operating in the brain that we can intervene on. There are a number of prejudice-reducing strategies that have been shown to be effective in reducing implicit bias. And Professor Patricia Devine from the University of Wisconsin has shown it is possible to increase the awareness of bias in adults, to increase their concerns of bias, to help them, enable them to implement multiple strategies. And these strategies are effective in reducing both explicit and implicit bias that remains evident even 3 months later. Researchers, though, are calling, we need to go beyond implicit bias and beyond cultural competence to think about structural competence. What do they mean by that? They mean that the implicit bias in our society, deeply embedded in our culture, has shaped the normal functioning of our social institutions and the policies and procedures that we have put in place. And we need to address those policies and procedures that implicit bias has created. What else do we really need to do? We need to create what I call communities of opportunity to minimize, neutralize, and dismantle the systems of racism that create these inequities in health. What are the things we can do? One is invest in early childhood. This is an example of the Peru preschool study, or we could look at the Abecedarian project in North Carolina that shows a preschool program has markedly striking positive effects on children that last throughout their lives in terms of better economic status, less involvement with the criminal justice system, less dependency on the social service system, and the Abecedarian project shows markedly improved health. Recent analyses of the Peru preschool project shows that not only the children actually benefit, but their siblings also benefit. So we are seeing a ripple effect for the entire family. We also, communities of opportunity, also need to utilize resilience resources to reduce the negative effects of discrimination on health. Here is a study by Jean Brody and colleagues. They assessed the levels of discrimination in African American teens in rural Georgia at age 16, 17, and 18. And for those kids high on discrimination consistently at 16, 17, and 18, by age 20, I didn't say age 40, I didn't say age 30, by age 20, they see considerable biological dysregulation, cortisol levels higher, epinephrine, norepinephrine, blood pressure higher, inflammation higher, and weight higher by age 20, linked to experiences of discrimination as a teen. The good news is, this association was broken among those African American teens who were high in social support. So good social support relationships from their friends, their family, their teachers reduce that association. A national study of Black Americans also found that higher levels of religious engagement reduce the negative effects of experiences of discrimination on the mental health of African Americans. And then there's a study from First Nation communities in Canada. This is a population with very high rates of adolescent suicide. And these researchers documented that although as a group, First Nation communities had high rates of adolescent suicide, there were some of the communities that had had absolutely no suicides at all in the last 5 years. And they sought to understand what were the protective resources. And what they found was those First Nation communities that were challenging the government for titles to land, for the right of self-governance, for control over their fire and education and healthcare services, and had a building for their cultural activities, each of those indicators produced a lower risk of youth suicide, and there was a strong dose-response relationship between the number of markers of protest, advocacy, and empowerment a community had, and the prevalence of suicide. So it gives young people a reason to live for. We also have research that tells us that we can build psychological resilience to at least cushion some of the negative effects of stereotype threat. So this is work done by Cohen and colleagues. They have taken Black and white 7th graders, and they asked them in one class period to identify their most important value, a value that captured who they were as a person. The goal was to affirm their sense of self-adequacy and self-worth. And what the researchers found, randomized control trial, that those Black students in the affirmation condition earned higher grades in the course in which they did this exercise, but in all their other courses. In fact, improved grades were evident for 70% of Black students, and this 1 hour intervention reduced the racial achievement gap by 40%, suggesting enormous promise here in terms of this type of psychological intervention. However, we need to think of resilience not just as a characteristic of individuals, but resilience as a property of environments and a property of social policy. So for example, reducing childhood poverty is one way to build resilience. Here is a UNICEF report showing America ranks near the bottom of the industrialized world health with this very high rate of childhood poverty. And we can see the latest data on childhood poverty. 1/3 of Native American kids and 1 in 4 Black and Latino kids are growing up in poverty today. Here is a striking chart from the UNICEF report. Let's look at the country of Ireland. What it shows you is the economy in Ireland, before taxes and transfers reflects what the economic system does, produces a child poverty rate of 42%. But when the Irish indicate their policy preference and their values through taxes and transfers, that is reduced to 8%. So in effect, they've reduced it from 42% to 8%. And you can see what other countries are doing. In the US, the economy produces a child poverty rate of 24%, and our values, our taxes and transfers reduces it 1 percentage point. There's a lot that we can do. This wonderful report from the National Academy of Sciences lists a broad range of strategies that could be implemented to reduce childhood poverty, cut it in half within a 10-year window. We need to accelerate progress along these lines and heed the words of Nelson Mandela, and be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Well, communities of opportunity also need to enhance income and employment opportunities for youth and adults. There's a lot of evidence from a broad range of policies, I don't have time to talk about all of them, that shows providing additional economic resources leads to improved health with no health intervention. Here is one example of one study that shows that raising the state level minimum wage by $1 leads to decreases in low birth weight and decreases in post-neonatal mortality in the United States. And if all states in 2014 had increased their minimum wage by $1, there would be 2,790 fewer low birth weight births and 518 fewer post-neonatal deaths. Communities of opportunity also need to build strong families. We often have discussions of family structure, and we often frame them in terms of values. They can also be framed in terms of economic resources. This is data that goes back a long time that shows that the marriage rates are positively related to average male earnings. When average male earnings increase, marriage rates increase, and when male unemployment increases, marriage rates decline. So Jay Teachman, a sociologist from Washington State University, has looked to see what impact would it have if we took young.
I'm so sorry, all. We have to transition back, but that is just a brief moment of Dr. Williams, who again just, you know, I really can't underscore how much he's done for our field, and I would really encourage you to get into his work. He has written hundreds of papers, and so it would not even be fair to say like start with this one, but in addition to his papers, again, he showed the everyday discrimination scale, which he also created, one of the first scholars to actually even say the word racial discrimination in a paper, because so many reviewers didn't even allow that term to get through. So just we owe him a debt of gratitude. And as the chat was showing, hopefully you all understand some of the connections between what he was saying today, which really he could teach our whole class, right? Like everything that we are talking about this semester, I think he bunched into today's talk, but certainly some of the perspectives that we're going to be talking about this week. So in particular, he's thinking about how some of the behavior that we engage in is around some of our thought process or our cognition. So what people know and think affects how they act. So some of the things that he was indicating, and I'm kind of skipping down to 3 now about the social environment, but these are things that are around us and they're going to impact the availability of certain foods, the way in which we engage with our families. It's not just behavior for behavior's sake. It's mediated, or what's responsible for it is this idea of the way that we think. The second element that's really important to know is that knowledge is necessary for, but it's not sufficient to produce most behavior changes. So we're going to be talking about that quite a bit, especially with respect to masks this semester, where people might know, and that even in and of itself, the word know is kind of muddled, right? Because there's been so much mis and disinformation that's come out. But knowing about something is not in and of itself sufficient to produce the behavior change that we're looking for. And finally, perceptions, motivation, skills, and the social environment are key influences on behavior. And one of the points that he just brought up, which I think is so important, is to think about how, $1 is going to impact an entire family, their ability to have additional resources, their ability to perhaps transcend from where it is that they currently reside, or what it is that's within their social environment. So even something like $1 can impact the social environment on the way in which families are able to access resources. So a model that is frequently thought about to engage the social ecology around us is this social ecological model. So we'll start at the bottom of the screen with this blue circle called individual, and that's the most proximal, or the most micro system. So that's the thing that's you and the things that are involved within you. So my knowledge, my skills, my attitude, that's within me. Those are all the things that I have in me that are being impacted by some of these other systems around me, right? So the thing that's most proximal to just me, the thing that I am around the most, is interpersonal systems. So things like families, friends, and social networks. Those are things that might shape myself as an individual, my knowledge, my skills, and my attitude. I'm most proximally or most closely connected to that interpersonal system. That's one system outside of me. Then there's an organizational system that is still covering the interpersonal relationships and that individual within it. So these are concentric circles. You see them as maybe Pac-Man eating, or like subsuming, right? The system underneath it. So the individual is within an interpersonal structure, and then the interpersonal community, those relationships or neighbors or things of that sort, are within larger organizations. So these are the social institutions with operating norms. These are things like schools, like a neighborhood block club, something of that sort. That's one level above just the relationships that we have as individuals. Then beyond that, there's the greater community. So that's when you're thinking about within a zip code, for example, what are all the schools that are around, or even a city council, something that's organizing several of those organizational structures that, again, have their own set of operating norms that kind of teach us how to move within our organizations and our interpersonal relationships, and what to think and do for ourselves. Finally, the greatest level is policy. So you can think about that from a national, state, local, or regulatory perspective. But those are, even if we would want to individually do something, or do something with our smaller clusters or community members, there are times in which we're not able to do certain things given greater policy structures and regulations. So thinking about all of these from an individual level perspective, but also how each informs each other, and how each are related, is a part of the social ecological model. So my goal this semester for you is for you to think about how the 2 frameworks we'll be talking about today will organize all of the systems, or all of the theories, or the models that we're going to be getting into for the year. So that individual level that we just talked about is going to be really important for some of the beginning theories that we're learning about, like health behavior model, etc. So a lot of the ones that are toward the beginning of the class are going to be individually based. And when you go onto the reading Google Doc, you'll see in the leftmost column that we're actually going through the class in these three levels from an individual, interpersonal, and community perspective. So this class is not going to get all the way to the level of policy, though of course policy is going to be an important element, and it's going to shape probably in the time that we're together, it's going to change and shift regarding some of the behaviors that we're talking about, but we're not going to explicitly get to some of those higher levels, but we will get quite a bit into the individual, interpersonal, and community level. So again, you'll see on the readings how these are going to be organized. But with this week, we're still really just in the orientation mode. We're just trying to get you thinking about how all of these theories that are coming up are organized and structured. So again, this week, we're learning quite a bit about the ecological systems model, and this is how, from an individual, interpersonal, and community perspective, we're going to be rolling out the next few weeks. All right, so what are the ways that our behavior can be maximized? The change that we're seeking, how can it be maximized? If individuals are motivated and educated to make helpful choices at the very basic level, again, within ourselves, that's one way that we can go about making changes. If social norms and social support for those helpful choices are strong, again, so the most proximal to the thing that's right outside of that, if the social norms and our social support are strong, then that can help us as individuals make those helpful choices. And finally, when the environments and policies support those helpful choices, again, you have three levels of those concentric circles building on each other. I really try not to be as political as my spirit is, but I read this morning about the rally, the indoor rally that was held for a specific Republican person who's running for office again. And this idea that there have now been 2 indoor rallies that have bucked the local policies of these cities and states really shows, I think, for these 3 bullets, just how important all 3 levels of that are. So you could be an individual who is really motivated and educated to make a helpful choice. You can have maybe a community around you proximally that is going to support that. But if you, for example, chose to go to this type of rally, and it was one in Michigan last week as well, but if you're choosing to go to these types of events and the policy or the moray around what it is that you're doing is negatively perceived, negatively evaluated within those spaces, then that can really encourage you not to go along with what you think is most healthful in that moment. So just a real world example of that not being maximized at this moment. All right, when we're thinking about ecological perspective, there's really 5 principles that we're going to drive home. And it's something that's already come up in the chat a few times now. Oh, I see a raised hand. That's really cool. Mega, I've never had the little eye thing come in. So you're the first one that we can try this out with. Okay, what's up?
Hi, I was wondering, what's the distinction between healthy and healthful choices?
Yeah, so helpful to me is just a way of maximizing the healthiness of the choice. So I can choose between pizza, which I had today, which is not healthy, but like of the options in front of me, that's like the healthiest, but a healthful option would have been like going to the store and getting a salad. So it's just maximizing the level of health. That's my understanding of it.
Thank you.
Okay, so with respect to the 5 principles, you all have already commented on this already, where there are multiple levels of influence. So again, we've seen these concentric circles. It's not just one, and one isn't weighed any greater than the other in that way. Environmental contexts are significant determinants of health behavior. So I think there are phrases that people might use around, nature versus nurture, or thinking about how an environment shapes someone. Some people don't think that an environment is as important, and especially in certain communities like the United States, where you have this rugged individualism, this idea that any person can make it, especially if one person did. Look at this one example of someone who made it. All of these people should be able to make it. Then that really bucks this idea that environmental context are significant determinants of health behavior. So that's something to really be mindful of, that we are shaped by both nature and nurture by our environmental context as well. It's likely that influences on behaviors interact across levels. So again, as we use that 3 kind of tiered example in the last slide, where you're not just able to do one thing quite well if like all 3 aren't aligned. It's really challenging to like be persistent and consistent if all of your levels aren't consistent or with what it is that you believe. And I wrote statistically and in practice because there are ways that, as we learn about creating models, that statistically you're seeing how one thing times another thing can have an exponential influence. So maybe to say that clearly, we've talked about those 3 levels. If I as an individual, if my systems around me, and if the greater policies were all in line, if 2 out of 3 of those things were consistent, that might be, you know, I have a 75% chance of engaging in this action. If only one of those things was there, maybe that's like a 13%. But if all of them are in there, like maybe I have a 99%. So it's not a perfect like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If you multiply some of those together, statistically, you'll see exponential growth in the health practices. So that's what I mean by that. Okay, the 4th element just to be mindful of is that the models that we're going to be using should be behavior specific. So yes, those concentric circles are something that you can really think about as the general guiding framework. But when you're wanting to talk about a specific behavior and you're getting into the nitty gritty of those, say it's an organizational level, like you want to think about what specific organization am I going to talk about in relation to this behavior. So you don't want to just stop at the higher level of individual, of interpersonal. You want to really think about what are the specific items within this greater level that are going to help me think about this behavior. And we'll actually show you one in just a moment of an example of a social ecological model with a specific organization that's looking at a certain type of behavior. So 1 second on that. And this is also a point that was brought up by Dr. Williams and someone in the chat as well, where multi-level interventions should be most effective in changing behaviors. So sometimes you'll have people who are just doing an individual intervention. Sometimes it's just social, sometimes it's just organizational. But really, if we can think about how interventions go toward a behavior in each of those sectors, then that's really where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. So something I really liked as a quote there is that the basic premise of the ecological perspective is simple. Providing individuals with the motivation and skills to change behavior cannot be effective if environments and policies make it difficult or impossible to choose healthful behaviors. Rather, we should create environments and policies that make it convenient, attractive, and economical to make healthful choices, and then motivate and educate people to make those healthy choices. So really a weaving in between all 3 of those, or the ones that we're talking about, those levels in particular here, can be really helpful. Okay. So we have, we're flying really quickly on this, so I otherwise would ask for questions, comments, or concerns, but I wanted to make sure that we had Dr. Williams, just a fantastic teaching today. So I'm just going to keep rolling through. So if you do have questions, hold them for me until the end, and if we can't address it today, we'll definitely answer it at the top of class on Wednesday. All right, so an example of a group that's trying to go across different levels is the Healthy Environments Partnership, or HEP. Their mission is to develop interventions to address aspects of the social and physical environment that contribute to racial and socioeconomic disparities in cardiovascular disease. So again, a specific issue that we're talking about, CVD, and we're looking at certain risk factors, the racial and socioeconomic challenges that relate to that outcome. So we're getting very specific with respect to the problem and some of the outcomes. It's a partnership between Detroit Hispanic Development Corporation, the Eastside Community Network, Friends of Parkside, Institute for Population Health, Henry Ford Health System, and the University of Michigan School of Public Health. So not just one element, we've got communities, we've got universities, lots of different levels here, different types of expertise. So no one should think that they are, quote, smart just because they're in, an academic institution. The folks who are living, breathing, doing the work on in these communities are often the folks with the most smarts, right? So like we can't think of ourselves as the hoity-toity folks just because we're a part of the UMM School of Public Health. So it's incredibly important to have all these folks as partners with us. So since their inception in 2000, they've examined some of the stressful social and economic conditions in Detroit neighborhoods and CBD risk. They've also examined built environments like neighborhood walkability and CBD risk, and food environments like the location of grocery store, access to healthy foods, and CBD risk. So again, different types of elements that are going across some of these different socio-ecological levels, as well as air quality and blood pressure, which is a bit different from CBD risk as their other ones have been. But really just want to focus now on the framework. So it's not using concentric circles, but if we start all the way to the right, actually, just to orient you a bit, you'll see some of the factors that might be more proximal to the person, so more of an individual level. These are things like my blood pressure, my depression, my chronic disease. Those are things that might be proximal to me. But when I use, again, that term proximate, it's about closeness. So the things that are most close to me and the things that are going to impact me as an individual are in the blue column to the left. So those are the stressors around me, like the neighborhood and housing conditions, violent crimes and safety, discrimination. What my diet is again impacted by some of those things around me, because how am I going to get access to those quality foods? So it's not always an individual choice what my diet is, but really what's going on around me that lets me to make that dietary choice. To the left of that are these intermediate factors like the built environment, air quality, et cetera, the social context. So again, the services that I can engage in, the investment that's going in into the community. Those are all things that are one level outside of what's closest to me from a proximate factor. And then the highest level, the fundamental factors, are these things like policy or political, economic, and legal processes, the ideologies, so the pervasive kind of norms and thought process of the greater structure, and then the distribution of things like material wealth, employment opportunities, et cetera. So even though this is shaped differently, what HEP is thinking about, their framework is very similar and is infused by the social ecological model. I see hands and I see questions. I'm so sorry, we gotta keep blazing because we have one more model to run through. If we do have time, I promise to answer it today, but if not, get them typed up in the chat and we'll be sure to address it on Wednesday. Sorry, y'all, David Williams. Okay, so the one other perspective that I think is really important to be mindful of in this class, and something that I really appreciated Dr. Williams talking about, was this life course perspective. So it's one way to think about family, right? It's something to think about, how does a child and how does a parent, for example, in a household setting interact with one another? And that's kind of what we're thinking about with the social ecological model. A lot of times in my work, because I am child focused, the child is in the center of those circles, and then the family is the next proximal piece. So it's the thing that's responsible for how the child is going to eat, what type of resources the child has. But from a life course perspective, we're really thinking about, for any given individual, how do they move across the childhood, adulthood, and later years, and how do things impact them individually across that lifespan? So that's what the way that I want to think about it is that the socio-ecological model is about taking a cross section. So if you were to look at all of those circles and kind of take a knife and slice into it, you're going to get a chance to see, like, oh, what is happening at any given time to this one person? Why might this one person be making this decision? Because I'm slicing through and I'm seeing all the different layers that this person is focused on. And then this is really cake oriented because it was my birthday last week. And also future Dr. Janae's birthday was 2 weeks ago and she didn't tell us. So just putting that out there. But anyway, this is cake oriented with the life course perspective, because now you're cutting along a sheet cake from Costco, where you're thinking about from a life course, from the start to the end, what is it that I'm seeing? So I'm going the full length that way versus cutting into something and going down through the different layers or through that ball for socio-ecological model. So that's just one way of thinking about how we conceptualize life course relative to socio-ecological. And so you can see that again here, where starting at this prenatal term, and again, Dr. Geronimus is really gonna, oh man, I have her for my other class to do a guest lecture, but not for this one. I was gonna say maybe I can have her come in. We'll see. Anyway, we'll at least play something from her. But Dr. Geronimus talks quite a bit about how even in the prenatal element, right? So before you're even born, the things that are happening to another family member, so that's socio-ecological, is gonna impact you. And then you are now born, coming into the world in your early years, throughout your working age and through older ages, and the things that happen to you in utero are still going to be with you over time. So that's that life course perspective in the boxes at the bottom from prenatal to older ages. But we do see at the top some socio-ecological constructs that are coming in. So the macro level context, what's going on in the world, the systems, those things that we'll get to on Wednesday, and some of the things that Dr. Williams was talking about, how that influences us, what the wider society thinks and believes. These are all the elements that are going to impact you. And as you see here from this trajectory line, where there's a box in the middle, the accumulation of positive and negative effects on health and well-being are over the life course. So this, again, is not a cross section, it's a longitudinal way of thinking about how do things that happen to me, even as early as in utero, stay with me and impact me over the span of my life. Okay, this is close to ending. So this is something that one of my colleagues and I wrote in a paper, and I'm curious if anyone knows this. So what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 feet in the evening? Anybody know what that is? Emily, I see you looking. You don't have to answer, I just see you. So I was just.
Yeah, it's a person.
Person.
That was Emily.
Yes, okay, you said it's what, Emily?
It's a person because, can I explain it?
Sure, go right on ahead.
Because babies crawl on all 4 legs, and then they grow up and walk on 2 feet. And then when they're older, they might need walking assistance like a king.
All right, let's see if Emily is correct. And I heard one other person say it as well. Let's see if they are correct. The famous riddle of the Sphinx coarsely describes the stages of human development, so 5 stars. The passing of the day in this riddle, signifying the lifespan, is coupled with a seemingly impossible change in the ambulatory ability of the riddle's answer, a person. However, careful and creative thinking allows us to envision the 2 hands of a baby serving as feet for crawling, and the assistance of a walking cane serving as a 3rd foot for an elder. So we're talking about race in particular in this paper. And yet racism has proven to be an even more impossible riddle for Black people in this country. Across the lifespan, racism similarly operates from morning until night, and just as Oedipus's ability to rid himself of the vice grip of the Sphinx required intentional and creative thinking, healing from racial stress requires not only a keen understanding of how that stress manifests across the lifespan, but also a commitment to alleviating its noxious effects. So awesome work, Emily. But again, just wanting to be really mindful. In this paper that we wrote here, we were talking about how racism differentially impacts children across their life, or people across their lifespan, starting with Black children throughout adulthood and to their older age. So one thing that I wanted to show just as an example, and we're actually wrapping up, so hopefully I'll be able to address a question or two, but to think about how this is where intersectionality I think is really important. So intersectionality is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit, but the idea of intersectionality is not just I hold 2 or more identities. It's about how those identities interact. When we talked about the statistical way of doing this before with cross-section, it is to say I have multiple things at once, and it's not additive. That is, it is not, I have the identity of being biracial, I have the identity of being young, and the identity of being middle income. So those 3 things, I have like 10 plus 10 plus 10%. those are 30% of my identities. It's not like that. It's how do these two things interact? How do these two things interact? How do these three things interact? So there's a multiplication between those three that not just for analytical purposes is one thing, but a lived experience is important. So again, my goal is not to make COVID outcomes or mortality something that we focus in on this class, but I did think that this was a really relevant example for some of the work that we'll be engaging in with mask wearing as something that will help to prevent some of these outcomes. So people are talking about the race disparity in COVID deaths, and they're talking about the age disparity, but they're not talking about how race and age disparities interact. They're not talking about older Black adults, said Robert Joseph Taylor, a mentor of mine here at the U of M Institute for Social Research. An analysis underscores the extent of their vulnerability. It found that African Americans ages 65 to 74 died at COVID-19 5 times as often as whites. In the 75 to 84 group, the death rate for Blacks was 3.5 times greater. Among those 85 and older, Blacks died twice as often. In all three age groups, death rates for Hispanics were higher than whites, but lower than Blacks. The gap between Blacks and whites narrows over time because advanced age itself becomes an increasingly important shared risk. So all that to say, whenever you see a graph or a chart or anything of that sort where everything is kind of condensed into one, this is a great life course kind of question on how COVID-19 impacts people differently. But one thing that myself and a lot of my colleagues are going to investigate, and especially what Dr. Williams was indicating in his talk, is just how much specific types of stressors that you're going to see from the socio-ecological model are going to impact that life course over time. All right, that was super quick. I'm super sorry. I know that we have a few questions. We have 2 more minutes. So let me just hear from you all very quickly. What's one thing that you learned today? How can you apply something you learned to your own life? If you need more clarity on questions, go ahead and put it in the chat. We'll get it down and we'll address it on Wednesday's class. And before I let y'all answer 1 and 2, super quick. So some of y'all were out here, Brandon, talking about how Twitter was really easy, right? So on Wednesday, I'm actually doing a Twitter chat for Reuters. Reuters is a health-based agency, a health-based news agency that has 22 million followers. So if anyone is super interested in getting their words out to the world about COVID and mental health, can you also chat me in the Zoom DM and I'll get you more details on how you can help. You can help me craft a tweet or create an infographic, but we'll be getting that information today, what the questions are. And if you would like to help, I'll make sure to email you. Whew, okay, so what's one thing you learned today? Super quick. Come off mute if you can. Or I'll read the chat. Taz said, one thing I learned is that intersectionality isn't just holding 2 or more identities, it's how these identities interact. Awesome. All right, number 2, how can you apply something you learned to your own life? Somebody come off mute, help me.
The healthy environments partnerships, or I guess theory in general, can be most likely applied to different populations. So I think that's really valuable, like Janae said. And I was envisioning how I could apply this hopefully in my future practice.
Great to hear, Jasmina. Awesome. Okay, well, if you have anything else, feel free to stay on board. I'm only staying a few minutes because I have to do my talk for that thing that Dr. Williams just did. But you all have a great day. We'll answer all the questions that you have in here. On Wednesday, we also have a guest there as well. I'm super excited to have him come and join us. Have a great day, all. Take wonderful care, be safe, healthy, and all that jazz. Bye, thank you.
Dr. Anderson?
Yep.
I have a quick question about the literature review. So sorry, I'll come off video.